Sunday mornings had a rhythm to them. The quiet hum of the heater kicking in, Cooper's tail brushing against the wooden floor as he followed me from the kitchen to the deck, the sound of birds finding their way back to my small patch of garden. I always took my coffee black on Sundays. No sweetener, no cream, just strong and hot, the way I liked my peace. I sat in my favorite chair, the one I had chosen myself when I bought this house 2 years ago. It had a deep cushion and a view of the garden that reminded me that everything I had now, I earned. Every brick, every mortgage payment, every daffodil in the backyard. Then the doorbell rang. Cooper's bark shattered the silence. He wasn't aggressive, just surprised. So was I. I didn't have guests, not on Sundays, not ever, really. I placed my coffee down and walked slowly to the door. Something told me, some old reflex, some deep-rooted tension in my spine, that this wasn't Amazon or a neighbor asking for help. I opened the door, and there they were. George, my father, with the same weathered hands I remembered gripping the steering wheel the night he drove me to Westridge, and Charlotte, his stepdaughter, my stepsister, standing beside him with a polite, carefully arranged smile. I hadn't seen them in 12 years. For a moment, I didn't speak. I just looked at them, wondering what kind of nerve it took to show up here, on my porch, like we were overdue for a casual chat. George cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of a jacket I didn't recognize. "Tanya," he said, voice lower than I remembered. I stayed in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. "What do you want?" Charlotte looked at the garden behind me. "You've done well for yourself," she said, skipping past any pretense of warmth. The words didn't sting. They floated, weightless. I could feel myself slipping into the version of me I had built brick by brick, the version that didn't flinch anymore. "I didn't expect to see you," I said, "let alone both of you." George shifted uncomfortably. "We were hoping to talk, maybe inside?" I looked at them both, noting that Charlotte didn't have her children with her. She always brought them, always used them like emotional vouchers. But today, she was empty-handed. I stepped aside. 10 minutes. They entered cautiously, like people stepping into a church after a long absence. I let them sit on the couch I had chosen. I remained standing. George started with something vague. Talk about family ties, about time, about how life just runs away if you don't grab it. I listened, letting the words wash over me like a speech I'd heard rehearsed. Charlotte didn't speak for a while. She kept scanning the living room, the books I'd stacked, the painting above the mantel, the absence of any photograph linking me to them. "We've been talking about the past," George said eventually. "How things ended. And how maybe it's time to reconnect." I tilted my head slightly. "Reconnect?" Charlotte folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I'm getting divorced," she said, finally. That made sense. The absence of her kids, the polite tone, the sudden need to reach out. George nodded. "She's had a rough time, moved back with us temporarily, but it's tight. You've got this whole place." He let it hang. But I knew exactly where it was headed. "You think I should let her live here?" George's face remained neutral. "Helping your sister is helping yourself. We're family." There it was. I could feel my throat tighten, not with emotion, but with memory. That word, family, had been used like a crowbar against me for years. Family was why they said I needed to be evaluated. Family was the reason they gave for why I couldn't come home. Now it was a tool again, dressed in empathy, wrapped in need. I looked at Charlotte. She didn't flinch, just waited. "You want my house?" I said. "The one I bought, the one I worked 80-hour weeks to afford." "It's just space," she said with a half smile. "You're alone here." I almost laughed. "You don't get to call it just space, not when you erased me from everything else." Charlotte blinked, unsure. George looked confused. I turned, walked to the hallway, and opened a drawer. I had kept something for years, a photograph. I took it out, held it in my hand, but didn't bring it back. Instead, I spoke. "The last family picture I saw had all of you. Wedding reception, wine glasses, everyone smiling." Charlotte said nothing. "You posted it with a caption, 'The whole Sossaman clan.' You do remember, don't you?" George looked down at his hands. My name wasn't even in the tags, I continued. You didn't just kick me out. You cut me out. There was a long silence, the kind that fills a room like water, slow and suffocating. How do you help someone who pretended you never existed? I asked. Tell me. Charlotte stood. We didn't come to fight. Of course not, I said. You came to ask, and assume, and walk into the life you helped dismantle like you had every right. George sighed. We just thought. You thought wrong, I said. They stayed a moment longer, hoping I'd soften. But I didn't. Not this time. They eventually left, walking back to their car in silence. I stood by the window, watching them pull away. I reached for my coffee, cold now, and took a sip. I should have slammed the door, I whispered, but I didn't, not yet. After they left, I didn't go back to my coffee. I didn't take Cooper out for a walk or call Sarah like I usually did when my mind needed grounding. Instead, I walked straight into my office, sat down at the desk, and opened the old Chrome bookmark I hadn't touched in years. My cursor hovered for a moment, and then I clicked. The screen loaded slowly, like it knew I wasn't ready to see it. But there it was, the wedding album. They had uploaded it to a shared photo site, password protected, accessible only through a link. I wasn't supposed to see it. A mutual friend had forwarded it to me years ago, not out of malice, but with an awkward, "You might want to know." I hadn't wanted to know. But I had looked. And now I looked again. Picture after picture. My father, standing proudly in a tailored gray suit, his hand around Lavinia's waist. Charlotte in a pale blue dress, holding a bouquet too large for her hands. Family smiling in rows, glasses raised, candles flickering in soft evening light, table settings, dance floors, speeches, hugs, but not me. I wasn't in a single frame, not a glimpse, not even in the background, like someone who happened to walk by. It was as if I had been edited out before the shutter clicked. One caption under a group shot caught my eye. The full Sossaman family. I stared at those words. My mouth didn't move, but something inside me screamed. Not even a missing Tanya, not even an empty chair, just a declaration that the family was complete, without me. When I'd first seen it, I didn't cry. I'd shaken so badly I had to sit on the floor of my apartment for over an hour. That night, I fell asleep on the rug, fully dressed, face against the cold wood. Back then, I didn't have language for what I felt. Not betrayal, not just hurt, something deeper, like I had been unwritten. Now, years later, it didn't hit like a punch. It slid in, quiet and deep. They didn't just reject me, they rewrote my absence. I closed the tab and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. And just like that, my mind drifted, back to when I still had a place in their house. When I was the youngest, the one who made the messiest pancakes, the one my mom used to call her shadow. She had a way of making the ordinary feel sacred. Sunday pancakes were layered with whipped cream and too many chocolate chips. Birthdays had poems, bad rhymes written in her loopy handwriting on bright paper taped to the fridge. Every holiday had a small ritual. Every day, a joke or hug or glance that reminded me I mattered. I remember one birthday. I think I had just turned 10. Mom read aloud the poem she wrote me at breakfast, and I'd laughed so hard I spilled orange juice across the table. Dad groaned and reached for napkins, and Mom just said, "That's what joy looks like." I kept that poem for a while, hid it in a box under my bed. When the box disappeared, I assumed Lavinia had tossed it, because by then, she had already started moving in. Lavinia didn't arrive like a thunderstorm. She came in slowly, like water seeping through cracks you didn't know were there. At first, she brought baked goods, complimented the photos in the hallway, asked about my grades, said all the right things. Then she started helping redecorate. She had better taste, she said. Slowly, the house began to change. The curtains went from floral to beige. The smell of cinnamon disappeared, replaced by something that burned sharper, like lavender with a bite. She started rearranging the living room, then the kitchen. Sunday pancakes were phased out. My chores doubled. Her daughter, Charlotte, didn't have any. I noticed every shift, even if I didn't say anything out loud. I started keeping score in my head. A picture of Mom was moved. A pillowcase was swapped. One afternoon, my favorite blue mug went missing. When I asked Dad about it, he said, "You've got 1,000 mugs." I didn't. I had that one. And then came the day everything tilted. I had just come home from school. The hallway smelled different. Less like us, more like a hotel. When I walked into the living room, Mom's chair was gone. Her recliner. The one she used to sit in when reading out loud to me. The one I'd curled into when I had the flu. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the empty space. Dad walked in with a grocery bag. I asked him quietly, "Where's Mom's chair?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked past me, like there was something on the wall he needed to inspect. "Lavinia thought it didn't match the room anymore," he mumbled. Lavinia entered behind him, smiling tightly. "It threw off the energy," she said, like that explained everything. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and went upstairs, closed my door, and sat on my bed, not moving until dinner. That night, I didn't eat. Later, I noticed the candles had changed too. Mom used cinnamon spice, always. Lavinia preferred vanilla lavender. I hated that scent now. Still do. It smells like erasure. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to see the memory jar missing, the one my mom and I had kept since I was 5. We'd write little notes every week about happy moments, then read them at the end of the year. I didn't ask about it. I already knew the answer. My room stayed the same for a while, probably because I never left it, but the rest of the house? It was no longer mine. The laughter was too careful, the air too still. The walls held things, but not memories. It wasn't that they wanted me to move on. They wanted me to vanish without a trace. There's a difference between moving forward and being shoved out. I sat on my couch now, years removed, and realized something. I had been gaslit into thinking I was imagining it all. But I wasn't. I had watched it happen, one subtle change at a time, and each one said the same thing. "You don't belong here anymore." It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the sun feels too bright for what's going on in your chest. I remember standing in the living room, holding onto the edge of the kitchen counter as my father cleared his throat in that deliberate, too-even way of his. Lavinia sat beside him, her posture rigid but rehearsed, like she'd practiced the pose in a mirror. "We've been thinking," he began, voice low, calm, like he was pitching a new chore chart instead of what was about to come next. "About what's best. For you and for the house." Lavinia chimed in. "You've been struggling, Tanya, and we don't want to see you spiral." I said nothing. They continued, trading lines like bad actors. "You isolate. You don't engage. Your mood swings concern us. You spend too much time alone." The phrases landed like darts, carefully chosen, carefully coordinated. "We've arranged for you to speak with someone," Dad said, avoiding eye contact. I blinked. "A therapist?" "Sort of," Lavinia replied, folding her hands. "It's a residential facility, just short-term, for observation." Observation? The word echoed, sterile and clinical. "You won't be alone," she added quickly. "They'll help you figure out what's going on." I looked between them. "And who decided I needed this?" "We all did," George said, like it was a family picnic plan. I wanted to shout, throw something, demand an explanation. But I didn't. I just stood there, hearing the sound of a lock turning that hadn't even clicked yet. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in well-lit rooms with polite voices and tea on the table. Later that night, when I was supposed to be packing a weekend bag, just in case, I opened my file drawer and found the packet they hadn't meant for me to read. A court order, folded neatly behind a permission form. I scanned the header, the official language, the stamps. Then my eyes froze on a single line. Parent, guardian signature. Eleanor Winslet. Eleanor was my mother. She had died 2 years earlier. Her name sat in black ink, shaky in form, but unmistakably printed. Except, it wasn't her signature. I had memorized my mother's handwriting. She used a looped E, always tilted slightly to the right. This one was stiff, robotic, misspelled. Someone had written Eleanor. I held the paper closer, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a typo. Maybe they scanned something old. But the more I stared, the more obvious it became. It was a fabrication, a forgery stitched together from pieces of hospital records. When I confronted George, he barely blinked. "It's just paperwork, Tanya. Don't overthink it." My throat dried. "That's not her name," I said. "She would have agreed with this," he replied, standing. "She'd want you to be safe." Safe. That word, too, became corrupted. You don't keep someone safe by erasing their autonomy. You don't protect them by dragging their mother's name out of the grave to sign off on a lie. I went to bed that night knowing I wasn't being taken for help. I was being taken away. And so came the car ride. George didn't talk much. He played talk radio like always. Lavinia sat up front, flipping through a folder, nodding occasionally. I sat in the back, hands balled into fists inside my jacket pockets. I had slipped a tiny voice recorder in there. It was old, the kind with a red button and a built-in mic. I'd used it once for a school project and forgotten to return it. I didn't know why I brought it that day. Instinct, maybe, or desperation. When we arrived at Westridge Youth Adjustment Center, it looked more like a clinic than a prison, but that didn't make it less cold. The tile floors stretched long and gray under fluorescent lights. The air smelled of bleach and the kind of sadness that clings to institutional walls. A woman at the front desk welcomed us with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "This must be Tanya." I nodded stiffly. George signed a clipboard. Lavinia stood to the side, silent now. They took my duffel bag and asked me to remove my hoodie. I hesitated. The recorder was still in the pocket. "I'm cold," I said. "Can I keep it?" "You'll get a uniform in just a moment," the intake nurse replied. I handed over the hoodie. Inside, they sat me down in a sterile room and ran through a list of questions. Standard intake procedure, they called it. "Have you ever hurt yourself? Do you hear voices? How often do you feel anger?" I answered quietly, hoping they'd see the absurdity. But I realized soon enough, this wasn't about clarity. It was about box checking. When I said I didn't want to stay, the counselor smiled faintly. "Your father signed off. You're here voluntarily." That word again, voluntarily. Like I had walked in on my own, with a suitcase and a dream to be evaluated. I sat in my assigned room that night, staring at the blank wall. My journal was gone. My voice recorder, probably tossed. But what stayed with me, sharper than anything else, was the sound of my dad's voice in the car. What he had said to Lavinia when he thought I was asleep. "She'll adjust. We had no choice. She's disrupting the house." That sentence wrapped itself around my lungs. I repeated it in my head until I could no longer hear his tone, only the implication. I wasn't sick. I was inconvenient, and they needed me gone. That night, I borrowed a pen from the nurse's desk and scribbled notes on napkins from the cafeteria. Every detail I could remember. Names, times, words. Maya Angelou once said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." I understood that now. If no one else believed me, I'd at least have the truth. Even if it lived in torn napkins and fractured memory. It was a Tuesday. Overcast. The kind of day that never fully wakes up. I remember pulling on a cardigan over my wrinkled shirt, trying to fix my hair in the hallway mirror before school, and hearing my name echo faintly through the kitchen walls. I should have known something was off. My dad never asked me to get up early unless something was wrong, and Lavinia only spoke to me when necessary, which wasn't often. When I entered the kitchen, both of them were sitting at the table. Dad had his reading glasses on, a manila folder in front of him, fingers drumming like he was buying time. Lavinia wore a button-down blouse I'd never seen before, the kind of thing people wear to make their lies look professional. "School called a meeting," Dad said, finally looking up. "Counselor wants to touch base. Just general check-in." I nodded. "Okay." He cleared his throat. "We'll be there too." That didn't sit right. Hours later, in a cramped office with peeling posters about safe space and expressing emotions, I sat across from the guidance counselor, Mr. Hamlin, while Dad and Lavinia sat side by side like courtroom parents. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, grades, attendance, upcoming finals. Then Mr. Hamlin hesitated, folding his hands. "There's some concern. Tanya's been a bit withdrawn. Teachers have noticed mood shifts." Before I could explain, before I could breathe, my father jumped in. "Tanya's always been difficult," he said. Not angry, not frustrated, just flat, like it was a statement of fact. "It wears us down," he added. "We try, but she doesn't respond, doesn't talk. She isolates. It's not healthy." I turned toward him slowly, trying to read his face. Was this rehearsed? Was he performing? Lavinia didn't look at me at all. Her arms stayed crossed, a quiet nod punctuating every word he spoke. "She's angry a lot," she said softly, as though it pained her to admit it. "And when she's not angry, she's distant." Mr. Hamlin scribbled something down. I kept waiting for someone to ask me something. Anything. But no one did. After the meeting, I walked out before them, backpack swinging loosely. I sat on the curb by the front office, knees up, chin resting on them. I wasn't crying, just thinking. Mr. Hamlin came out 20 minutes later and offered me a ride home. I declined. Before he left, he said, "You've got a support system, Tanya. Use it." I smiled, politely. "Sure." Inside, I felt something closing. A door, a file, a version of me I'd worked so hard to build. I had clawed my way out of isolation that semester, joined a poetry group, started eating lunch at the far end of the cafeteria with two other girls who didn't mind my silence. But after that meeting, things shifted. My English teacher, Mrs. Carson, who used to joke with me about sonnets and let me borrow books from her personal stash, started treating me differently. She didn't make eye contact as often. Didn't smile when I entered the room. At lunch, the other girls still sat where we always did, but they looked up less when I arrived. It wasn't hostile, just distant, like they weren't sure what label to assign me anymore. The label had been applied. Difficult. And with that label came silence. Polite, quiet, isolating silence. The kind that wraps itself around your shoulders like a shawl that looks warm, but never actually warms you. Then, 2 weeks later, Miss Reet Jurvetson disappeared. She'd been my school counselor for a year and a half. The only adult who asked questions that weren't scripted. She noticed when I stopped talking. She noticed when my hair stayed unwashed too many days in a row. Once, she asked me why I always sat near the window. "Because I like knowing there's a way out," I told her. She smiled and said, "That's an honest answer." Reed had mentioned to me that she was writing something, had said, "I'm not ignoring what I see." That was the last time we spoke. The next week, she was gone. No explanation. A new face sat at her desk, a substitute with too much perfume and not enough tact. I asked where Ms. Jurvetson went. No one gave a straight answer. I overheard the new counselor saying something about reassignment. Rumor was she had filed a report. Maybe that was true. Maybe not. What I knew for sure was this: she had seen me. She had noticed. Years later, after I'd rebuilt enough of myself to walk into that school without wanting to shrink into the floor, I returned to request my old transcripts. I needed them for a licensing application, and it felt like swallowing glass just stepping onto the grounds again. A young receptionist who clearly didn't recognize me handed over a manila envelope. "There was an extra file in the drawer under your name," she said. "You can toss it if it's not needed." I nodded, took the envelope home, and opened it that night in my kitchen, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but curiosity. Inside was a typed letter, dated 6 days before Reet left, addressed to the principal, never sent. In it, she wrote, "I am concerned about the narrative being built around Tanya Winslet. My professional opinion is that this student is being emotionally isolated at home. Step-parent dynamics appear to be damaging. Tanya does not exhibit clinical behaviors warranting removal. She needs support, not surveillance." And then, a sentence that stopped my heart. "Silence isn't neutral. In some homes, it's a weapon." I read that line over and over. There it was. Proof that someone, anyone, had seen what I went through. Someone had validated the reality I'd been made to doubt. She had tried. And her voice, even muted, had somehow reached me across years. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a plastic sleeve, and slid it into my personal binder. Not for court, not for public consumption, For me, it became scripture, my proof, not for the world, but for the small, shaken girl I used to be, the one who sat on the curb after the conference and pretended that support systems were real. But silence wasn't the only weapon they used. The second time they came to my door, they didn't bring apologies. They brought papers. It had been a week since the first visit. I had almost convinced myself they'd disappear again, that they'd gotten the message when I didn't beg them to stay. But that morning, just before noon, the doorbell rang again. Cooper barked once, then laid down near the entryway, almost as if he knew we weren't welcoming company. I opened the door slowly. George stood there, holding a manila envelope, and Charlotte was behind him, her expression blank. Not embarrassed, not hopeful, just patient. Like she'd been through this routine before and was ready to recite her part. "Hi, Tanya," George said. "Do you have a minute?" "Make it fast," I replied, stepping aside but not inviting them in. He didn't wait. He walked right in, sat on the edge of the couch like a lawyer about to read a will, and handed me the envelope. "What's this?" I asked, staying standing. "Options," he said. "We thought maybe if you had a chance to look through some possibilities, you'd see it's not unreasonable." Charlotte nodded, taking a seat beside him. "It's not permanent," she added quickly. "Just until I get back on my feet. You have the space, Tanya." I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. I was too focused on George's face, how calm he looked, how much he avoided eye contact. "We know you're still holding on to a lot of pain," he said. "But bringing up the past won't help. What matters is now." That was it. The sentence that snapped something inside me. I placed the envelope on the coffee table, crossed my arms, and looked him dead in the eye. "Are you threatening me?" He blinked, surprised. "No, of course not. I'm saying, if this becomes a legal fight, there's a history on record, and we'd rather not go there." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "You already went there 12 years ago." "I just didn't have the right shoes on to follow." Charlotte stood. "This is ridiculous." "No," I said, voice low but steady. "What's ridiculous is you pretending like the house I bled for is a safety net you're entitled to." George sighed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "And you're mistaking my silence for weakness," I replied. They left soon after that. Quietly. No slammed doors, no hugs, just the rustling of paper and the slow shuffle of people who had once called themselves family. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Legal jargon, suggestions of co-ownership, subtle clauses about transfer of residence rights in exigent circumstances. It was dressed in neutral language but smelled like control. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I pulled out a highlighter and started marking every line that reeked of manipulation. That night, I made a list. Every time they used my silence against me. Every person who benefited from my willingness to not make it worse. Every instance where my trauma became their tool. And then I opened the drawer where I kept my old files, school letters, discharge papers, scanned court documents, and I added that envelope to the top, because if they wanted to bring up the past, I'd be ready. But on my terms. My thoughts wandered back to high school, not to the counselors, not even to Lavinia, to Kyle. Back then, Kyle had been everything I thought I needed. Attentive, funny, quick to compliment, but never invasive. He had a way of making me feel seen, or so I thought. We'd met in sophomore English, bonded over our hatred of group projects. He brought me coffee once when I forgot breakfast. He kissed my temple the day after my mother's anniversary. And then he testified. I didn't even know he'd been called in until afterward. During a school administration hearing, George and Lavinia had presented concerns about my emotional state. They'd brought witnesses. Kyle, one of them, described how I punched a locker in frustration once and cried uncontrollably at night. Both true, but not the whole truth. They didn't ask why I cried, or what I'd been holding back. They didn't mention the time Kyle forgot to walk me home, or how I sat alone outside because no one answered the phone. Just that I had cried, loudly, and that I had hit something. They made me sound unstable. Dangerous. Kyle said afterward, I didn't lie. I just told them what they asked. And then he walked away. blending back into the hallway full of students who now looked at me like I might explode. I remember the silence that followed. The girls who stopped passing notes, the teachers who stopped calling on me, even the janitor avoided eye contact. Nobody wants to sit next to the crazy girl. Now, in my 30s, I realized that wasn't the last time someone weaponized my emotions. It was just the first time I noticed. I reached into the back of my closet, pulled out a small flash drive labeled, "For when they come for what's mine." I had started the file after my discharge from Westridge. Slowly, over the years, I had added to it court minutes, mental health evaluations, emails from social workers, my own journal entries scanned and dated. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about documentation, because facts don't need to shout. They just need to exist. The next morning, I drove downtown to meet April, an old friend from a legal aid clinic I volunteered at during college. I didn't go there for hand-holding. I went for clarity. She took one look at the envelope, then the flash drive, and nodded slowly. "You've got leverage, but you're also exposed. If they spin this right, you'll need to be ahead of it." "I intend to be," I said. We walked through options, protective filings, asset lockdowns, even a potential defamation angle if they tried to bring up my institutional record in court. "You sure you want to go this route?" she asked. "It'll get messy." I leaned back. "It's already messy. I'm just done pretending it's not." Back home, I put the flash drive in a fireproof box. I took a deep breath and looked around my living room, the shelves I built, the curtains I sewed myself, the flooring I paid for in 3 installments. I whispered aloud, not to anyone, but to myself, to the air that had held my story too long. They built their version of me out of my silence. I'm done being quiet. It started with a polite lie. I told the school district I needed a copy of my high school transcripts for a licensing renewal. The woman at the front desk didn't question me. She was young, maybe 22, knew enough not to recognize my name, or maybe just too focused on her screen to connect the dots. Either way, I was glad for it. She smiled, typed something into the system, and pointed me toward a narrow hallway with a temporary sign taped to the door. "Records Archive, staff only." "I'll buzz you in. Just give me a knock when you're done," she said without looking up. The air in the archive room was stale and full of dust. Rows of filing cabinets hugged the walls, and a humming old computer sat in the corner. I knew what I was looking for: digital records from 2012. That year had been redacted from my memory, but I remembered the student ID number my mother once taped inside my binder. I typed it into the system, pulled up my name, and clicked into the first batch of files. What I found didn't make sense. The first red flag was a document labeled Initial Behavioral Assessment. The diagnosis was vague, something about impulsive episodes, threats of harm, paranoia. None of it sounded like me. None of it matched my history. Not the journal entries I'd written, not the feedback from the only teacher who ever listened. Then I saw the top of the scanned page, scribbled in faded black ink, then scratched out in pencil. Charlotte Cook. Underneath that, in a cleaner, almost mechanical font, someone had typed in Tanya Winslet. My stomach turned. I printed the page, holding it in trembling hands as the machine whirred slowly, like it, too, was reluctant to let the truth out. I looked around the room as if someone might come in and tell me to stop, to put it back. But no one came. When I brought the printout to the front desk, the young woman glanced at it, then shrugged. "Probably just a clerical error," she offered. "That old system does weird stuff sometimes." I nodded but didn't smile. "Sure." Outside, I sat in my car and stared at the page. A clerical error doesn't swap identities on a mental health record. A clerical error doesn't erase someone's behavior and assign it to someone else. This wasn't a mistake. It was a substitution. Later that evening, back home, I opened my laptop and searched deeper. Using that same student ID number and filtering by year, I found more files: incident reports, internal memos, student conduct logs. There it was again. A suspension record for a student who had threatened a teacher in gym class. Another note about a fight during lunch. The reports were short, clinical, full of coded phrases like disruptive demeanor and defensive tone. I remembered that week. I hadn't even been at school. I was out with the flu, but the name on the file was mine. Another document read, Family requested discretion due to ongoing mental health evaluation. It was signed by Lavinia Cook, Charlotte's mother. I sat there for several minutes, unable to move. It wasn't that the system had failed me, it was that it had been used against me. The erasure wasn't accidental. The reshuffling of truth wasn't clerical, it was orchestration. And I had been the scapegoat. I started writing everything down, dates, document names, the language used in each form. I flagged each file with colored markers, orange for altered, yellow for suspicious, red for enraging. I scanned everything into a folder and backed it up to a flash drive I kept labeled Buried Truths. It wasn't about revenge, it was about recovery, about reclaiming pieces of myself I hadn't even known were missing. Back in my office, I created a new timeline on the whiteboard. On the left, my actual life, what I had done, what I had experienced. On the right, their version, the paper trail they had left to support their narrative. I drew lines between the mismatches. There were a lot of lines. I remembered what one of my old therapists once told me. She had leaned forward in her chair, eyes steady on mine, and said, "The story you don't tell becomes someone else's to rewrite." I hadn't understood it fully at the time. I do now. That night, I made tea, the same kind they had served at that first visit, chamomile and honey. I poured it into the cup Charlotte had once used and set it on the counter. Beside it, I placed 2 sheets of paper. One was the altered diagnosis, the other the suspension report with my name typed over Charlotte's behavior. I stared at them both, then walked away. Left them there on purpose, like evidence at a crime scene that the killer had accidentally returned to. They had tried to write me out by writing someone else in. Now the files would speak for themselves. They thought I'd be too ashamed to speak. They were wrong. The key still fit. That fact alone told me just how little had changed and how much they assumed I'd never come back. But I wasn't here to visit. I wasn't here for reconciliation or nostalgia. I was here to retrieve what had been buried. Literally. It was mid-morning on a Tuesday. I knew Charlotte would be at work, or at least that's what she told the world on her Instagram stories. Lavinia had a volunteer shift at the hospital on Tuesdays, still clinging to her image as community pillar. And George, well, ever since his retirement, he stuck to a schedule even tighter than when he was employed. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons reading in the park. I had timed this for a window of quiet, a gap in their routine. I parked 2 blocks away. Not out of fear, out of strategy. I didn't want the neighbors seeing my car and alerting anyone out of habit. Cooper stayed behind this time. This wasn't his business. Stepping inside, I expected dust or neglect. What I got was transformation. Everything was beige. Beige curtains, beige carpet, beige throw pillows on a couch I didn't recognize. It was like someone had scoured Pinterest for a neutral sanctuary and applied it without thought. There was no soul left in the place, no photos of me, no trace of my mother. The kitchen smelled faintly of vanilla, that artificial kind found in too many hand soaps. I moved quickly, feet silent, memory sharp. I didn't need to look around long. I knew exactly where she would have stored it if she hadn't thrown it away. I passed my old bedroom, then paused. The door was open. I peeked inside and froze. The walls were lavender, the kind of pastel tone that tried too hard to be calming. My bookshelves were gone. In their place stood a wall mirror and rolled yoga mats. A Himalayan salt lamp glowed orange in the corner. There were woven baskets, fake succulents, a speaker softly humming meditation music. It was a yoga room now. My room, where I'd cried over missing my mom, where I'd journaled about Lavinia's coldness, where I'd once imagined my future hanging like stars above my bed, had become a space for deep breathing and downward dogs. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just turned around and walked to the basement door. The stairs creaked under me. The air grew colder, thicker. I flicked on the light and moved past the holiday bins and labeled plastic tubs until I reached the far corner, behind the cleaning supplies, half covered in dust. There it was, a simple cardboard box with a cracked red lid. I knelt down, pried it open. Inside, the memory box. My mother's handwriting still visible on the lid, faded but intact. I lifted the top gently. Inside were letters, small drawings I made in elementary school, a dried flower she'd saved from my first recital bouquet. And underneath it all, the thing I came for, a blue velvet pouch holding the bracelet she wore every Sunday. The one Lavinia had called too outdated and had accidentally misplaced. I stood, holding the pouch to my chest. Then I heard the front door. Voices. 2 of them. I didn't panic. I moved silently, slipping behind the stairwell just out of view. Charlotte's voice was unmistakable, sharp like cracked glass. She laughed, then sighed. "She's never going to fight us," she said. "She never does. They still think she's too broken to retaliate." My pulse spiked. Another voice, female, unfamiliar. "Then use that. Get the house. The court won't even question it if you frame it right." "Exactly," Charlotte said. "We'll paint it like she's unstable, alone, unable to handle a family dispute." They laughed. I didn't move. The rage I felt wasn't hot. It was ice cold. Focused, precise. I had suspected. I had pieced together hints. But this was confirmation. Not just cruelty, strategy, calculation, intent. They weren't just trying to rewrite the past. They were building a case to steal my future. I waited until I heard them walk upstairs, voices fading into the hallway. Then I slipped out, quiet as a shadow. The box was tucked under my arm, the velvet pouch in my jacket pocket. Outside, the sun had shifted positions, casting long lines on the sidewalk. I walked back to my car the long way, not because I was scared, but because I needed to breathe. Back home, I placed the box on my dining table. Then beside it, I laid out the growing pile. Printed files, scanned documents, Charlotte's altered school records, Lavinia's court filings, and now, my own overheard audio. I sat at my desk and opened a new document titled Timeline of Manipulation. I started typing. Date, event, evidence, pattern. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building. Every story they told, I'd counter with a fact. Every lie they circulated, I'd expose with proof. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for court. And this time, I would not be the quiet one in the room. I synced my phone with a secure recording app, set it to auto-record all calls, all conversations, anything within range. If they wanted to play legal, so would I. And when the next knock came, I'd be ready, with more than a shaky voice and hurt feelings. The memory drive was tucked deep inside the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, wedged between outdated tax documents and a half-finished will I never signed. It was labeled in black marker. Backup 2012. At the time, I'd written it like an afterthought. Now, it felt like a key. I plugged it into my laptop and waited. The drive spun to life, slow, like it too had aged in silence. There was only one file on it, no folders, no backups, just a single audio clip named Drive Home. I clicked play. Static crackled. Then voices, my father's voice, unmistakable, cool, composed, too calm for the context. "She's spiraling," he said. A pause, then Lavinia. "She isolates. She lashes out." Then my father again. "We had no choice. She was getting in the way of the family's stability." The words struck harder than any slap could have. I remembered that night clearly now. 17. Wearing a hoodie with a pocket large enough to hide the tiny recorder I'd borrowed from school. I didn't even fully know why I brought it. Instinct, maybe, or fear. Probably both. They thought I was asleep in the back seat, thought the car's hum would drown out their truth. But I heard every word. I remember staring at the ceiling of the car, focusing on the stitching of the upholstery, willing myself not to react, not to break the illusion that I hadn't heard a thing. Back then, I didn't do anything with the recording. I buried it. I buried everything. The lies, the betrayal, the way George spoke about me like I was a failing appliance that needed replacing. Now, all these years later, I listened again. Every syllable, every pause. I played it twice, then a third time, and still, I didn't cry. Instead, I opened the file cabinet once more and pulled out the guardianship document I'd been handed just before they institutionalized me. I had accepted it then, without knowing I had a right to question it. Now, I questioned everything. The signature at the bottom claimed to be from my mother, Eleanor Winslet, but something had always been off about it. She died 2 years before that paper was stamped. I'd never said anything. Grief had a way of making you doubt your own instincts. But now, with the audio in my hands and years of emotional distance, I compared the signature to her hospital forms from 6 months before her death. They didn't match. Her real signature had gentle curves, the kind of fluid movement that only came from someone who wrote slowly, carefully. The signature on the guardianship form was too clean, too flat, like someone had scanned a discharge note and copy-pasted her name into a place it didn't belong. I held the two papers side by side under the light. My chest tightened. They hadn't just removed me, they used my dead mother's name to do it. I reached for a sticky note and wrote, "They didn't just silence me. They spoke for the dead." I placed it on top of the flash drive, letting my fingers linger on it for a moment. The weight of what I held wasn't just legal, it was sacred. My mother had been turned into a ghost of consent, a convenient voice in their manufactured script. That realization didn't break me, it clarified me. I picked up my phone and called April. She answered on the second ring. "Tanya?" "I have something," I said. "It changes everything." She didn't ask what. She just said, "Email it, I'll encrypt it and store it off-site." I sent her the audio file and scanned copies of the guardianship document along with the comparison signature samples. I included a timeline, a note that said, "There is more. This is just the start." While the files uploaded to the private drive April maintained for her legal clients, I turned back to my laptop and opened my voice recorder settings. Auto record enabled. Cloud, backup, activated. Timestamps, mandatory. From now on, every call I received or made would be stored in real time, with logs and redundancy. Not because I planned to ambush anyone, but because I would never again rely on memory alone. They taught me to second-guess myself, taught me that silence made things easier. But this time, I wasn't just listening, I was archiving. I backed up my audio, double encrypted it, and set a timed auto email to myself every 48 hours. It felt obsessive, but it felt necessary. After everything they'd done, the lies, the signatures, the manipulation of legal systems and emotional trust, I refused to let them frame my narrative ever again. They buried the truth. I was digging it up, with timestamps, signatures, and a voice that didn't tremble anymore. And the moment they showed up again, I knew exactly which file to pull first. I started digging into the past the same way I approached everything else now, methodically. It began with April's login to a legal archive system she used for her pro bono cases. The interface looked outdated, but it held what I needed. I typed in George's name and set the year filter to 2012. There it was, filed 3 weeks after I was admitted to Westridge. Chapter 7. Bankruptcy. Sossaman, George P. Petitioner. I scrolled through the scanned documents, each page a small betrayal, the declaration of assets, the debt schedules. I paused on the section labeled Educational Accounts. Nothing was listed. I sat back, stunned. My mother had left a college fund. I knew this. She'd told me when I was 14, made me promise to use it wisely. That money was supposed to be untouchable, protected for me. But here it was, vanished from the records. And yet further down, another document surfaced. A tuition reimbursement schedule. Charlotte's tuition paid in full through 2013, not delayed, not paused, not affected. They had declared bankruptcy, just not for her. I printed out the entire file and began highlighting everything in red: the date of my institutionalization, the filing date, the tuition payments, the missing asset line where my fund should have been. They didn't run out of money, I murmured. They ran out of reasons to care. Later that night, the house was quiet. Cooper was asleep at my feet, his tail flicking slightly with each exhale. I opened a new tab and did something I hadn't dared to do in over a decade. I Googled myself. The results were surprisingly sparse. Some property records, a few tagged photos from old high school friends, and then it appeared. a blog archive from a defunct local news outlet. Headline: Troubled teen removed for psychiatric evaluation after domestic disturbance. I clicked. The article was short, just 4 paragraphs. It referenced an incident that prompted legal intervention. The source: a family representative. No name, but I didn't need one. They'd used my old school ID photo, the one with the frizzy hair and the tired eyes. The image looked like it belonged on a missing person poster. There was no quote from me, no follow-up, just a closing line. The student is receiving care and cooperation is encouraged. Encouraged by whom? Lavinia? George? I remembered being told, just cooperate and this will go away. And it had, gone away from public memory, from school records, from polite conversation. But not from me. I had lived in the shadows of that article, even when I didn't know it was there. I printed it too. Then I compiled everything I had: the bankruptcy file, the article, the school records, the forged signature, the audio recording, the falsified mental health notes, the emails Lavinia sent the district, all of it. I put them into one large binder, chronological. I called it Truth, Unedited Version. I flipped through it, page by page, as if I were rehearsing. Not for a courtroom, not yet. But for the day someone asked, "Why didn't you speak sooner?" I wanted to answer with pages, not apologies. I wanted to hand them a binder instead of a breakdown. I sat at my desk and drafted an email to Deborah Jackson. My subject line read, "Request for consultation." But the body of the email wasn't technical, it was personal. I told her everything, briefly, clearly. Attached the binder, highlighted what I considered the strongest evidence. Then, at the bottom, I quoted Oprah Winfrey, something she once said during an interview that had stuck with me since college. "Turn your wounds into wisdom." I wrote, "Deborah, they built their version of me out of silence. I'm done playing the quiet one." Before I hit send, I added 5 more recipients. Journalists. Bloggers. A woman I knew ran a podcast about institutional abuse survivors. And April, for backup. If they weren't going to tell the truth, I would. And I would do it with documentation, not rage, not rumor, receipts. I clicked send. Then I leaned back in my chair and let the tension roll through me. It didn't vanish, but it shifted. They wrapped their lies in silence. I'd unwrapped them in truth. Let them prepare their defense. I was just getting started. It started with a voicemail. Deborah Jackson's voice came through my phone's speaker, calm, composed, but layered with something I hadn't heard from her since high school: urgency. I read everything, every page, every signature. "You've built a better case than most lawyers I know, Tanya. I'd be honored to represent you. Pro bono. And not just civil. There are criminal implications here." I listened to her message twice, then sat in my kitchen staring at the binder labeled Truth, Unedited Version. My hands were steady, but my chest buzzed with something that felt like electricity and grief wrapped into one. Someone from my past, someone who had seen it all before it unraveled, was choosing to stand beside me. Not because she had to, because she believed me. Again. I called her back. "Yes," was all I said. She didn't ask me to repeat it. By the next morning, cease and desist letters had been emailed and hand-delivered to George, Charlotte, and Lavinia. No more direct contact, no more manipulation masked as concern. They were now legally warned not to approach, threaten, or attempt to leverage my history for any property, custody, or inheritance claims. The first reaction came within the hour. George called me. Twice. Left no message. I didn't answer. Charlotte followed with a text. "I don't understand why you're doing this to family. We're not the enemy." I stared at the message for a while before responding. "You had 15 years to be family. You chose to be predators instead." She didn't reply. That afternoon, I walked into Deborah's office with the binder under one arm and a list of witness names in the other. Her office smelled like lemon and clean paper. The kind of place where truth didn't come dressed for comfort, but for court. She looked up from her computer, smiled slightly. "They're already feeling it," she said. "Rumors are moving fast. Charlotte's ex just filed to reopen their custody agreement." I blinked. "On what grounds?" "Emotional instability and manipulation," Deborah replied. "He submitted a screen recording of one of her group chats. Your name came up." A pause, then she added, "Your father was removed from his HOA board this morning. Lavinia's volunteer coordinator at the hospital confirmed her schedule's been reevaluated." I leaned back in the chair. "They wanted attention. They're getting it." Deborah's eyes twinkled. "This isn't revenge, it's clarity." Later that week, a producer from a local podcast called Familiar Strangers reached out. The show focused on family betrayal and survivor stories. April must have passed along my binder. "I read your timeline," the producer said. "It's not just compelling, it's surgical." They offered a 45-minute recorded interview, one guest, one mic, full editorial control. I agreed. We recorded it in one take. I didn't script anything. I just told the truth, slowly, without dramatic flair. I laid out the facts like pieces on a chessboard, each move deliberate, from the forged signature to the misfiled suspension, from the doctored press release to the audio confession. When asked what I would say to my family now, I answered without hesitation. I didn't run from my family, I ran from abuse, and I used the law to walk free. The episode aired 2 days later. I didn't watch the download count rise, but people started emailing me. Strangers, listeners, other women who had been labeled too much or too emotional or a liability by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Some messages were short. "Thank you for saying it out loud." Others were long, gutting. From women in their 60s who had been institutionalized for refusing to marry, for getting pregnant, for talking back. One woman wrote, "I'm 72. My mother signed me into a ward because I refused to stop drawing. I never touched a pencil again, until now, because of you." I cried after that one. Quietly. Not out of sadness, out of the weight of knowing how many of us were carrying stories that were never meant to be ours. The interview ended with Deborah's voice. "Justice is late, but not absent." Those words echoed in my kitchen days later when I received an email from George. Subject line, a request. "I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just don't want the world thinking I'm a monster. That's all." I didn't reply. Forgiveness isn't silence. Forgiveness isn't a gag order. Forgiveness is a choice I might make one day for myself, but never as a favor to the people who buried me alive with paper and lies. They thought they'd destroyed my credibility. Instead, they turned me into an archivist of my own truth. The consequences weren't mine anymore. They belonged to them now. And the truth was just beginning to cost them. The knock came mid-morning. I wasn't expecting anyone, which these days meant I was absolutely expecting someone. When you expose a house built on secrets, people start showing up, not to rebuild, but to bargain. I walked to the door slowly, already knowing who stood behind it. The weight of the footsteps on the porch gave it away. Careful, hesitant, too familiar to mistake. When I opened it, George stood there alone. He looked small, smaller than I remembered. His clothes hung differently, like they'd been bought for a broader version of himself, like he hadn't filled out much of anything in a long time. His hair was grayer, but not the elegant kind, the kind that looked stressed into existence. "I came to talk," he said. I stepped aside, not out of welcome, but because I wanted to control the space between us. He walked in with a slight limp I hadn't seen before. I didn't offer him tea. I didn't even ask him to sit. We stayed in the hallway. George shifted his weight. "I've been reading some of the things circulating." I raised an eyebrow. "Things?" "The podcast, the file, your binder." He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like someone holding a broken piece of something he couldn't fix and barely recognized. "You built quite the case," he added, quieter. I didn't reply. He looked down at his shoes, then back at me. "I just wanted to say, we did what we thought was right, at the time." There it was. The apology that wasn't. I didn't give him a response. I let the silence hang, thick and unavoidable, like a mirror he couldn't avoid. My stillness said more than any outburst ever could. He cleared his throat. Lavinia. She pushed hard. Too hard. I didn't know how to stop it without losing everything. You didn't lose everything, I said finally. You gave it away, piece by piece. He swallowed, lips tightening. I didn't mean for you to get hurt like that. You said enough, I replied. Just not to me. He seemed to wilt then, shoulders folding slightly inward. I walked past him, retrieved a sealed envelope from the console table near the stairs, and handed it to him. He didn't ask what it was. I told him anyway. It's a copy of my discharge form, from Westridge, the date, the conditions, the funds, everything, in case you forgot what it cost. George took the envelope like it was £1,000. We stood in silence a moment longer. Then I opened the door. We're done here, I said. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in defeat, and then he stepped outside. I closed the door before he could turn back. The house didn't feel lighter, but I did. After he left, I poured myself a glass of water, sat down on the couch, and let my mind drift back to the day I walked out of Westridge for the last time. It was a Tuesday. They gave me a paper bag with a few belongings, most of which weren't mine anymore, one folded hoodie, a paperback I'd never finished, a broken pen, and $17 in cash. No one came to pick me up. I asked if I could use the phone. They said I'd used up my call the day before when no one answered. So I took the bus. A kind nurse slipped me $3 bills and a few coins, whispering, "Just in case." I sat by the window, hands clutching the fabric bag, watching a city I didn't recognize pass me by. Everything looked too loud, too fast. I got off 2 blocks from a shelter. The place smelled like bleach and desperation. The woman at the desk gave me a cot and a toothbrush. That night, I slept in my clothes, shoes under my pillow like a kid afraid someone might take them. Freedom doesn't taste like celebration, I had written in my journal that night. It tastes like cold metal and fluorescent lights. But it was mine. That broken night was mine. No signatures. No threats. Just me and the ache of what came next. I journaled every day after that. Not for healing, at least not at first. I wrote to remember, to have proof that I existed, that I endured, that I knew. That paper bag, those $17, they were the last things my family gave me, and it was enough. I built my life not in spite of it, but because of it. The silence they handed me, I turned into clarity. The shame they expected me to carry, I turned into voice. And the past they tried to write me out of, I turned that into chapters. Like this one, letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean forgiving on command either. It means choosing not to let someone else's guilt live rent-free in your bones. George had come hoping to unburden himself. He left holding proof of what he cost. And I was still standing. I knew it was time the moment I looked around my living room and saw all the fragments of my life, framed photos of Cooper and me, stacks of files, and the binder labeled Truth, unedited version, lining the coffee table like trophies. The house felt different now. It felt like home. When I scheduled that meeting, I told no one why. Just, we need to talk. They thought it was a property negotiation. Charlotte, Lavinia, George, and their attorney showed up with smug expressions, expecting to walk in and stake their claim. They hadn't bargained for the courtroom I created in daylight. Part 1. I greeted them in the living room. The table was cleared, the blinds shut. On display, folders of legal files, printed transcripts from the audio drive, my carefully constructed timelines, scanned documents, like evidence in a trial. Charlotte opened her mouth to speak first, but I stopped her with one phrase. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to end it. Silence fell. I directed them to the layout of files. This wasn't revenge. It was resolution by fact, not apology. Beside me stood Deborah Jackson, lawyer and witness, the one person who believed me before the papers and recordings proved the truth. She held the binder so I could point at it when needed. I clicked on a tablet to play a short clip, the B-roll recording from Westridge, my dad's voice saying clearly, "We had no choice. She was getting in the way of the family's stability." Every head turned toward the screen. Faces drained. That moment, facts undeniable, did more damage than the worst confrontation ever could. Part 2. I took a deep breath. And here's what I paid, I continued. I laid out my life in bullet points. Waitressing double shifts in college, working weekends at a real estate firm while studying for my agent's license, closing on this house with zero family support, and all the while carrying the weight of being branded unstable. I looked directly at Charlotte. You want to live here? Then you better pay back every hour I bled for these walls. I pulled out a thick envelope, the psych file she supposedly had hidden under my name. She'd panic when she realized I had that too. Charlotte's eyes widened. Lavinia shifted uncomfortably. George was pale. I used that reaction. Part 3. I slid across the table a single sheet of paper, a legally binding restraint drafted by Deborah. It barred them from claiming, visiting, or affiliating with me or my assets. George glanced at it. His face tried to say something but stopped. He didn't object. Silence admitted it all. Lavinia stood. She looked like she might sign, but didn't. She looked away, unwilling. I opened the front door slowly. Then leave. Not a single inch of this house will ever belong to you. Charlotte broke. Tears, not genuine, I could tell, fell. What about the kids? She sobbed. We're family, she pleaded. I didn't hesitate. Your kids have Google, I said coldly. One day, they'll read the truth. They left. Not a confrontation. Not a rescue. Just people walking out of a house they never really belonged in, leaving my story intact. I watched Charlotte's heels disappear down the walkway, then George's hesitant shuffle, and finally Lavinia's stiff retreat. I closed the door and leaned back against it, still, composed. No tears. No shakes. It felt complete. Climax and resolution. I moved back inside, shutting the blinds again, but this time for comfort, not closure. I walked to my desk, taking in the space I built through work, resilience, and truth. Every bill, every late night, every hollow dinner where I sat silent, every time they tried to rewrite me with paperwork, they all became vows I wouldn't forgive. I walked to the coffee table, placed the binder and the envelope in neat stacks. I poured another glass of water, then exhaled, all at once, hushed, complete. There was no next chapter for them. For me, there was peace.